Everyone, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today and for supporting Friends of St Mary's. I'd just like to make a thank you first to Reverend Janice, who has allowed us to be in the church this afternoon. She'd normally be holding a family celebration service, so we're very grateful. The atmosphere and the whole talk is about the church, so we're very grateful to be here. And we have apologies from our chairman, who is unable to be with us today. So I'm just going to give you a very quick note about Friends of St Mary's. We're celebrating our 30th year as an independent charity to support the major repairs and refurbishments of St Mary's Church. And we're currently working on the renewal and refurbishment of 9 endangered tombs outside, which were earmarked by the quinquennial report some years ago. We have done 4 at a cost of 35,000, and we are now working towards doing the last 5 at a cost of 44,000. So these events are all there to help towards the funding of those projects. They just help to keep topping up the interest from our investments and to make these projects possible to do. Steve Tomlin, who's here today with us, has given his time and his resources absolutely free to us this afternoon. So we have no overhead expenses, and we're absolutely delighted to welcome him here. His remit is he's just driven by his love of churches and the history of them. So you'll be very entertained. And you may have seen his CV on the screen, and I don't believe it's going to stop there. I think he's got a lot more to give to a lot of charities and organisations. So I'd like to welcome Steve, who I think you may know. And I think he actually knows our church better than we do now. He's been exploring it in nooks and crannies for months. So I hand you over to Steve.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you. I'm extremely grateful to Jill, who's helped me so much, and to Anthony, who is one of those who's going to take the blame for all the mistakes I make. Now, I've determined. First of all, can everybody hear me? They usually don't need me shouting down microphones with the mic. You prefer the mic? That's okay. Is that all right for you?
Yeah.
Okay.
You need to get closer.
Okay.
Get closer.
Okay. Is that all right for you? Right. Okay, I'm going to block my copybook straight away. We've got the vicar with us. Now, I sought permission for this, and because it's John Betterman, I don't think I'm going to get the blame. This isn't going to be a poetry recital session, but I couldn't miss this. It's called Blame the Vicar. When things go wrong, it's rather tame to find we are ourselves to blame. To get the trouble over quicker, to go and blame things on the vicar. The vicar, after all, is paid to keep us bright and undismayed. The vicar is more virtuous too than lay folks, such as me and you. She never swears, she never drinks, she never should say what she thinks. Her collar is the wrong way round, and that is why she's simply bound to be the sort of person who has nothing very much to do but take the blame for what goes wrong. You're warned. Okay, it's not going to be a poetry recital, but you should each have copies of Larkin's poem. Larkin is famous for being that very intellectual 1950s snide. There were a group of British poets at the time, and they travelled around. But to his great credit, he often said what other people in those days, certainly the BBC, wouldn't say. And I draw only from the poem which you've got, that one line, because it's my motivation. Who will be the last person to know this place for what it really is. Okay, we've got a lot to get through today, and what I'd like to do, I've got to put things in context, and it becomes essential to describe the church and explain the way it is. The church, as you see it today, is not the church of the medieval period. Anthony, is it possible to hit 5? Most people ask me how I got into what I do. I was working with the photographer Andy Marshall, and we got the commission to go into Salisbury, to St Andrews. And we photographed it, detailed it, and enabled it so that they could restore the Doom painting. One of the things that's not clearly understood by people attending to churches today is how different the medieval church is. First of all, behind me would have been screened, unlikely to have any pews, and the clergy and the choir would come in and they would withdraw to behind that screen. The service would be conducted in there in isolation and in Latin. And forget literacy, there were barely books available except to the very privileged. So the early church is vastly different from the church that you know. And the church would have been coloured with these Doom paintings. I'm going to come back time and time again throughout the evening, throughout the afternoon, talking about places some of you may know, like South Lee, which still have their Doom paintings. Sadly, the Victorians got hold of this place and many other places, and they ripped everything off the wall. They disposed of the original pulpit. The destruction of the Victorian period. I mean, dear old Henry VIII gets it in the neck for everything. Henry, when he came to power, actually primarily inventoried English churches. He was interested in the money. He was interested in silver. He was interested, until probably 5 or 6 years, only in power and control and getting the church's resources. The destruction that followed in the with the end of the monasteries and the churches was relatively minimal compared to much of the damage that was done by Elizabeth I subsequently, and James I, who we know for his services and the Common Book of Prayer and the St. James Bible. He systematically took the interiors out of churches. The church as you see it, in a pre-literate society when the services were in Latin, for an ordinary person were dependent upon the dramatic visuals, and they were dramatic. And the whole issues of Christ in majesty, and on the one side he would have angels elevating the good to heaven, and on the other side there were horrendous images of devils and dragons and people fed into their mouths and boiled alive. And so this was the phenomenon of the modern church, of the medieval church. This business of what was evil, which was punished, and if you were in compliance, you had elevation. Anyway, listen, I need to start at the beginning, and I need to go back a little bit. When the Romans came to Britain, the received wisdom is that they brought Christianity. They didn't. They were only in the early ages of conversion themselves, and they were what is called syncretic. They still continued to worship Mars, Venus, all their traditional sun and moon gods. And they were very, very tolerant. They took a determination to remain tolerant, and they accepted the native religion that was here in the initial period of the conquest. Now, some people attribute that and call it druidical. Now, most of what we know about the Druids comes from Julius Caesar. Caesar never met a Druid. He had information that was given to him mainly from Gaul and France. He certainly never met anybody in Britain prior to the writings that we have inherited. And it's interesting that it is really the only historic, hard information. It comes from Julius Caesar, and it's invented as a confection to create a standard and an idea that there was a virtuous society. Now, the Druids were primarily in northern France. They were not here. There were Druidical forces here, and they were primarily in North Wales and South Wales. It was a Breton and Bryonith culture. It was completely different, and it was based on folklore. It was disparate. It wasn't unified. It wasn't singular. And so most of the simple history that we pick up at school is actually a fabrication of convenience. It makes us feel comfortable. There was no unified British religion until Christianity comes along. And the Druids, for what they're worth, they are gone effectively by the time the Romans leave in about 800, although there's a lot of evidence emerging the Romans remained in minority. Now, with the demise of the Druids, if they existed as a sophisticated organisation, which there's so little historic information and fact and detail available to substantiate what is a held and received wisdom by generation upon generation of historians, they virtually disappear. They are then reinvented in the 1850s, 1860s, and any Welsh people here will have to help me. It's Yojo Morganowy. Eddie Morgan, as he was known to his mates. Eddie Morgan fabricated a druidical record. Publications, numerous volumes of poetry attributed to having a druidical origin, totally fabricated. Most of the druidic experience as we know it today, that we witness and see at Stonehenge and at Avebury, is absolutely a fiction that's late 1880s, 1860s if I'm generous. Now, the consequence of that is that we've got this idea of this romantic image of the Druids. There was a culture, a folk culture. It was diverse, it was tribal, it was local, and it was as diverse. And Christianity gradually comes in. One of the things when you do research, and I want to talk to you about Apotropaics, the magic in the church, one of the things that you do the research, you realise the extent of the battle that has ensued within the British church, or churches. There are things called canonical laws, and these are directives that come originally from Rome. Now there's a myth. We think of the Roman Catholic Church as being based in the Vatican. No, it's not. It was based in Belgium and in France. There were two French popes at one time. So there is an overstatement of the Roman involvement, but nonetheless the Catholic Church was an enormous influence. And we come up to Henry VIII, and I've got to jump quite a bit back tonight because I want to get on to talking about Apotropaics and magic and the things that you come here to listen to. But it is necessary to understand that there was a battle about every element of the buildings, these wonderful buildings. Behind me would have been screened off, and that's where the services were conducted. I can't move from this microphone, but you notice there are 4 or 5 levels of steps. Each of those were elevations. In these canonical laws, we find that there were battles about the very existence of crosses, of crucifixes, particularly crucifixions, that's either a Taurus or a cross with a Christ body on it, very much favoured by the Catholic Church. There were whole bodies, religious groups, that campaigned to evict those images as symbols that were unacceptable, idolatrous. And we're not talking about one or two marginal pieces of information. We're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of books which detail the battle for the right to control images in the church, and how powerful the Catholic Church was in its preparedness to support the images of saints. And during the interval, I would encourage you, if the vicar will allow us, to go through to the altar at the top, and behind it is one of the most remarkable reredos in stone. It's got a whole series of saints. I have got so much documentary evidence to show that in many churches, beautiful works like that were ripped out as idolatrous. They were not acceptable images, and post-Henry VIII, there were Protestants who absolutely felt that images in the church were the wrong thing. Now, so far, I've been talking about the establishment, the church. What's going on in there? Out here, in public. This is where the general, and they were compelled to come to church. They came in, and they would have milled around. Usually the priest would remain this side of the screen, bless the congregation who were left to their own ends. And that's where we get expressions like the week to the wall. He was announcing the service would start, and the week would go either outside or they would be around. And much of the business and all sorts of things, the business, the commerce, the determination of legal contracts, took place within the environs of the church. It was a melee of social interaction, but it wasn't for ordinary people until much later in English history a vehicle for participation in religion, as we at school have been led to believe. The reality was that, we jumped now, the images, the doom paintings, that if you go to South Lee, that's one, not Alscott, Blackborton is another local, which is an extremely good church, still has residual doom paintings. They were horrific, and whatever teaching was directed not by the senior clergy, but by the curates who did much of the work. Because the people who actually owned the advowsons, the entitlement to own the money that the church generated, they were often absentee. Here, I'm told, there were 3 vicars. This is very, very unusual. There were 3 vicars. This place was enormously influential, and it had an influence and an interaction with Lincoln, with Winchester, with Canterbury, Cirencester, and many other places, Ancient and that. It was a centre of religious activity. There is a collapse that comes with the alterations in farming, and we haven't got time to go into those things. But what I want to get over to you is that if you were an ordinary person in here, you were threatened with punishment. You were threatened with, you were promised redemption for conformity. And you had to go back into the church, where I often, in my life before I started to do this, heard expressions such as purgatory. And I thought it was damnation. Purgatory was actually a commercial vehicle. You purchased a transitional period when people prayed for you, lit candles for you. And the selling of candles was a major commercial means and source of money for the church. And many of the alcoves that you see these days, often with bodies in them, stone bodies or memorials, you notice that they are within the context of the walls of the church. Many of the people who came to the church, rich and very influential people, they weren't necessarily nice people. They had many, many enemies. And because the period of purgatory was a period of transition, they couldn't be buried. And they were fearful, post their death, of people seeking retribution while they were in this transition of purgatory. And in this transitional period, when people were saying their prayers for them, they paid the church a lot of money. And then they could move on after a period of time. And then we get things such as indulgences, which came through from the Catholic Church. And I want to talk about pilgrimage a lot today. People made pilgrimages and they bought all sorts of edifices. Now I'm struggling at the moment because I've got to speak into a microphone and I've got all sorts of things that I want to physically move backwards and forwards. I'm going to raise my voice in a minute because I think you will be able to hear me, but it will free me to actually make this more interesting. Okay, Apotropaics. You're the medieval church. You have a fear of punishment. So there's a great folklore that continues after the Romans have left. And you have to remember the word pagan in Latin means country folk. That's all it means. It's Latin for country people. So ordinary people were encouraged and it was inculcated in them to be fearful of punishment. And this is where fear comes from. Now at the same time, within their folklore, country people, simple people, pre-literate people, many of them practiced all sorts of rituals, all sorts of, here we go, magic. In actual fact, they were just country practices. And they had a fear of devils, they had a fear of punishment. And so, they used Apotropaics. Now, Apotropaics, let's get over this, because usually what happens, we come to the halfway point, and I spend the whole interval trying to explain what Apotropaics are, because I've talked and talked and talked and not explained them. They are votive marks. Now, if you notice around the church, I've put some labels. They may have fallen off. They're bright coloured things. And there are all sorts of little crosses. When you go through your interval, if you go round here, if you go round here to the side, you will see that there are all sorts of marks. They're not always cruciform, sometimes they're hexafoil. I need to break away from here. During the interval, if you come up, you'll be able to see. These are just some. One of the things that I often say is if I had a choice, I wouldn't have conducted this conversation here. Alvescott would have been perfect. We'd have only needed to stand in the vestibule, and it is covered in votives, in protection marks. These are marks that the country people assumed would ward off evil and drive away forces that they didn't want. That's why they're often around windows. Now we come to the Victorians that I've referred to, and they've ripped everything off the walls. So you've lost your doom paintings, and you've lost many of your Apotropaics. As we come on to it, I'll show you that there's still dozens here. There's a wonderful gentleman sitting over there called Dave Rose. And I had the privilege this week, having been in and out of here for 2 months doing the investigation, I finally got into the church tower with him. And the church tower has not been touched. It's quite remarkable. There are hundreds and hundreds of votive marks, including, we may come, there's a carved image of the church as you go up the stairs. And Dave, who's been ringing bells for 50 years, tells me he never noticed it. But he wasn't wearing a headlight, lamps and torches, and there are dozens and dozens of votive marks, and not just votive marks. There are a dozen of what we call reverse R's. And these are the marks of Catholic recusants. The whole tower, we have got dozens of them there, are from the Catholics who worshipped in this church, who carved reverse R's. This, right, now, the V you see there, this is in the church tower. When it's like that, it's what we call Virgo Virginian. This church exists because there is a well across the fields there called Lady Well that was said to have healing properties. Now, somebody's going to have to bail me out. Because I've moved away, St. François, she escaped a rather aberrant suitor and retreated here and lived very near here. She discovered, or it is attributed to her, that Lady Well, which had healing properties, was her doing. And that's as a result of why this church exists and has become very, very famous. Because of the healing properties. Now, I have a scientific background. I am a logical person and I don't deal in mumbo jumbo. But the reality of the medieval period is that where there were springs and where there was water, it was deemed to have a magical quality. It wasn't mumbo jumbo, it was part of folklore. It was part of rural life. It was an intrinsic part of rural life. The whole thinking systems, magic. Not mumbo jumbo, but rural thinking. Now, as a consequence, when they came to church, they were fearful that evil spirits could come in. I could demonstrate as a scientist that there are no evil spirits. Could I? Medieval people believed it. It doesn't matter whether it's provable. It was the received wisdom that there were forces of good and evil. And that the only way they could retaliate was by sometimes witchcraft. I resist using that expression because I don't want to be associated with it. I'm a historian and I'm a researcher. I have no time for fabrications that have no substance. But as a historian, I know that country people believed in magic. And they brought it into the church. And although they wouldn't have a long name like syncretic, it ran parallel to Christianity. I'm so used to being in another church, I went to point the pulpit. Now, those of you that attended the Broadwell lecture recently, I had a colleague read, because let's get down to this. This isn't just a fabrication of country people. If you go to Deuteronomy 28, there are 64 or 65 curses issued in the Bible, and they're there. In the Bible, and during the interval we might be able to look at that. Now, going further from there, you'll be aware of the King James Bible. But you don't know about his other book, which is demonology. King James was obsessed with magic. He was obsessed with demonology. It doesn't matter that he wanted to persecute it. The fact was he believed in it, and this is a copy, a photocopy of it. So that is the King of England, the head of the church. He believed in forces of magic. What I'm trying to do is not make a case for magic, but make a case that magic existed. And it was a common belief amongst country people. And so the thing that I'm interested in, I've spent most of the last 10 years researching, discovering Apotropaics. They're all sorts of things. They're little crosses. They're sometimes hexafoils. I've actually got somewhere, we'll do it in the second half. At church down in Gloucester, there's a mermaid with a flute from 1300 that's put by the door. And the notes are supposed to defer wicked forces. I've got, from near Fairford, a wonderful angel which, I don't know where we put these. I think there's some over there. There's a wonderful angel carved by the door as you go into the church. Some of them are very, very small. In this church, all the way around the columns, you'll find these little crosses. It's called a poté. Now, I need an assistant. And Anthony gets the blame for everything. Well, the vicar gets the blame for everything. But Anthony is going to help me now. Very quickly, lest you think, Anthony, assistance. If you go that side, there are 486 different crosses that are apotropaic that you could find if you start looking for them. All right? In this church, behind, on that column there, and there's some stickers on these columns, you'll see every single column here. Thank you, Anthony. That was brilliant. Every single column in this church, this gentleman is pointing at one there. You've got these are apoté. They're very, very small. The sad thing is that most of the apotropaics have been destroyed. You wait till you go and get your break. Have a look at the ones on the column round there. They're all the way up the wall. I can't allow you to go into the church tower, but let me assure you, if you can get in there. And the vicar's a really nice person. I'm looking at the vicar as I say this. I think you should run tours, because the tower is extraordinary. And the gentleman over there, even he believes in apotropaics now. Thank you, Dave. That's great. Okay, so I want to go on to, there are numerous books, and apotropaics, some of them are simple cross symbols. Now, the argument was, or let me go back to this medieval thing. During the medieval period, if you were deemed to have broken the law, and arraigned before the local gentry, the punishments could range from fairly brutal things to horrible imprisonment. You could indemnify yourself by going into the church and offering to go on pilgrimage. Now, in the vestibules, in the doorways, you'll find lots of strike marks. They're just lines. And they are said, the received wisdom, is that they were pilgrims who marked either the arrival at somewhere like Walsingham or Canterbury or Compostela, and then they crossed them the other way when they returned. Now, I have a colleague here who's actually filming what we're doing at the moment, and she came up to me and said that the crosses, you can see them when you walk round, when we have a break, are Knights Templar. They're crosses. I don't think the Knights Templar did that. But there are lots and lots of things. Like some of the strike marks you find, I'm told there's people sharpening swords. Now, there's so many myths. But pilgrimage, as Chaucer defined, as Charles Chaucer demonstrated, was a really, really big phenomenon. And you could indemnify yourself from criminal accusation and free yourself by going and returning. One of the things that pilgrims did was to make marks and leave marks in the churches, and that accounts for a great number of apotropaics. Now, I've got so many things to get through that what I want to do is slightly change the theme, and I mentioned canonical law, and this is the stuff that comes down from on high. The way many of these churches, or our churches, were run during the medieval period were by curates. And they had to celebrate canonical hours. And they were and these were very rigorous. They start at dawn and they went right the way through. As many as 9 ceremonies during the course of the day. So, one of the things we started to discover, and they're on the church outside here, are mass dials. I don't know whether anybody can see these at this distance, but effectively, they're called sundials. They're not sundials. They're scratch dials or mass dials. And they can only function with a gnomon, a stick in here, casting a shadow round the south part. You see them at Fairford. There's a massive one. and it goes all the way round. It wouldn't work above the halfway line. And these are said to allow the curates to know when the canonical hour is there. We have scientists and mathematicians who, after 400 or 500 years, can't make that stand up. But they're everywhere, and there are 2 or 3 on the outside of your church. This is quite a late one. This would be about, this is fake, by the way, that I've carved. This one would be, in this design, 1700. The very simple ones, and they really are a skill form to see. They're virtually obliterated. This would be a Saxon one. Very, very simple. It would have a stick in here, which would cast a shadow. Now, there's a man called Horn and others who've written treatise upon treatise. You can't believe how much information there is. And I go in and out of churches, and every other vicar and every other person, congregant, tells me they've walked in and out of their church for 50 years and never seen these mastiles. But they're there. And they were there to assist the curates. Now, let's move on again. Whoops. Consecration crosses. Another historian who's been working in the church towers just wandered in. This is a consecration cross. There are 2 or 3 in this building, but they've been obliterated. Now, canonical law says there have to be 3 consecration crosses on every elevation, south, west, north and east. And if you go through the history books, you see Canterbury and Salisbury ranting at churches because they've not consecrated their buildings. There have to be 12 inside and 12 outside. Anybody who knows Inglesham knows that they're like the one I showed you a moment ago. They're like a red or pink, and they're quite big. Sometimes they're just concentric circles, but there should be 3 on each elevation. And when you go around the country, they're in different forms. Some are carved stone and very complicated. Others are just simple lines. We have found consecration circles in here, but they've been eradicated by the vandals that ripped this building apart, that destroyed its history. But the church is bound to have those consecration marks. So that's consecration circles. And some of these things have all come out of why we find crosses and symbols in church. The law requires that the bishop comes and he's provisioned with a 7-foot, don't ask me why, 7-foot ladder that he uses, now can I say chrism? This is holy water. And each of these areas are supposed to be marked with a circle before he arrives. He strikes them, climbs his little ladder. Why a 7-foot ladder? He strikes them, he sanctifies them, and then subsequently there should be a lamp over them. But they're not here. But they are often mistaken as Apotropaics, but they're not. They're consecration circles, and they should be here with the full authority of the church. And if you go to the altar, you will find that the altar table should have 4 little crosses in the corner, and sometimes a 5th one. You wouldn't believe how many churches I go in and the altars are not consecrated. You're all right here. Yeah. You're safe. Okay, now listen, I've got it going, and I think probably it's a good time to have a break. Has everybody been able to hear what I'm saying? I find it very restricting, stood by a microphone. Okay, Jill, is it a good time to...
Yes.
And even if I haven't entertained you, I'm told that the drink and the hospitality is excellent. I'll see you in about 15 or 20 minutes. Thank you. Far more to talk about than we can reasonably expect you to tolerate. But I'm going to race through a few things, and then if you want to ask some questions, or you just want to flee, go. But somebody talked about witch marks. Now there's a whole iconography, and there are people that gather, and there are assemblies, and they do nothing but talk about witch marks. The reality is, the British building trade, it was a tradition that when you got to doing the roof work and the timbers, you burnt the timbers with candles, and they were called witch marks. British building trade. This is a fake one, by the way. Yeah. And witch marks are, again, protection marks. The other thing that came from Belgium was the Bellamine jars, which were purchased during the 1700s. And people put pins in them. They're like a bulbous jar, like a half-pint milk bottle. And they would be corked. They'd often put urine and pins and hair. And these were all practices that were carried out by country people in the belief that it would be a protection mark. But where you hear about witch marks and burns, nearly all of it is done by, right through to the 19th century, you'll find it's done by builders. And that, I hope that deals, I mean, we could conduct an entire afternoon talking about witch marks. We haven't got time. Things that I need to talk about. I want to get, I'm being told here, yes, to mention that in the Tower there was a hurricane here in 1928. Yep. And it's written amongst lots of graffiti. If you can ever get into the Tower, all the way up the Tower there's graffiti. And one of the things, if you start to look for Apotropaics, be warned, bell ringers are troublemakers. They love graffiti. They'll write on anything, bell ringers, and there are lots of rabbit holes that you can go down, and they're not authentic. Right, I want to try to go back slightly. There are things called bestiaries, or bestiaries if you want, and reveries. Women of any status were expected to own a breviary. They were heavily illustrated, and they had writing all the way around the edge of the images, very heavily based on the cult of the Virgin Mary. And there was an expectation of women of status to perform rituals, canonical rituals throughout the day. Obedience, devotion, as we associate almost in a caricatured way with nuns and abbesses and but they were actually devotions that were dictated by the books, and the books were called breviaries. Some of these breviaries, and women, particularly Tudor women, recorded all sorts of things in private comments, so they became like diaries. If you could buy a breviary today at Sotheby's or Christie's, you probably pay £10,000 for a book. But it was a directive for women to perform obedient service to the church. Now we come on to bestiaries. The language of the apotropaic world and the church is full of words that do confuse. So, bestiaries were directives that were issued from Central, often from Canterbury and from Salisbury, and they would be given to the builder or the stonemason. And they are of gargantuan animals, of grotesques, of all sorts. Hence why you get so many images within churches and water spouts and gargoyles and what have you. Now, most of the apotropaics that you will encounter are very small. Sometimes, not much more. Not always. Okay. So if you ever get a chance to go to North Cerney, which is just north of Cirencester, you get manticores, and that's an actual size. And there are two of them. One on the west wall and one on the north wall.
We think that they're slightly later. But these are, now, can I just say, for explanation, manticores were supposed to be indestructible. They would have the body of a lion, the head of a man, and they were not killable, and they were protection marks. North Cerney Church has got 2 of those on the exterior, and they are spectacular. And there are people in the village, I lived in North Cerney at one time, and they don't know that they exist. If you ever get a chance to go to Astle Lane, there are consecration circles and hexaforms, huge ones. It would bore you to death. We've recorded them all, we've measured them, we know where they are, and we've got dozens. Sorry, somebody's just about to ask. Oh, sorry, I do apologise. If you can see, perhaps you can look at these afterwards, you'd be very welcome. Point being is that Apotropaics come in lots and lots of different sizes, lots and lots of different types. The doorway is always a good place. Windows are a very good place. The church tower here, but you have to know somebody to get there. But you have to be very nice to the vicar if you want to get in there. So, we dealt with bistries and breviaries. Now, sorry, yes?
Who would actually carve these?
Stonemasons.
So,
oh, no, you mean the Apotropaics?
Yes, so would I just go up and decide to...
These little crosses here, I think, are done by the ordinary congregation.
Yes.
And they're protection marks. These guys, I suspect, have been done by somebody with some real skill, and possibly, therefore, stonemasons that were working there. The gargoyles, you see, are done by stonemasons. The stonemasons were often itinerant travellers, and they would go between minsters, churches, and they would perform. And they often weren't very well paid. Their retaliation was to put some fairly outrageous. You get green men, you get gargantuans, you get distorted animals, and I probably am going to avoid shieling gigs. Does that mean anything to anybody?
Yes.
Oh well, I can get away with it. These are fertility symbols of naked women, and there's a whole culture of them. Has anybody been to Kilpeck?
Yes.
Kilpeck is extraordinary in Herefordshire. I mean, it really, there's very nearly, it's one of the most wonderful places to go. But don't be shocked by the Shilna gigs. I think we've got a Shilna gig at Oaksey. Yeah? Oh, anyway, there are so many elements of what I talk about that we could indulge and go on. I'm trying to race through them and get through to them. Now, while you were having tea, I didn't tell you about this. Did anybody notice the door?
Yes.
Yeah. There are just hundreds of these. We don't understand them. And they're on the door round the corner. They may be Merle. They may be a game that choir boys played. But sometimes they're used for counting and identifying. They act like a calendar. And there's loads of them round the corner. There's a little apotropaic on the far side. And there's, when you get them like that, at Virgo Virginium, and then they're called Marian marks when they're inverted like that. All part of the worship of the Virgin Mary. Having done this for about 10 years, I'm in York, and I'm sat there, and I'm actually listening to somebody talking. And this remarkable professor from Norfolk started to talk about log almanacs. And most of the room were just log almanacs. Okay, she has specialised in them, and what she found, there are about 33 of them left in the world. Some of them are this long. The smallest ones are about 9 inches long, and they're on 4 sides. And they've got chunks carved out of them. And they are for the saints' days. And I'm sat there, and I'm with my colleague, Andy Marshall from that photo side. Andy does virtually every major cathedral and all of Friends of Friendless Churches, the Church Conservation Trust. We photograph all over Britain. We fly drones inside the churches. We know things that are going on that nobody in any previous generation has known. And we're sat there, and Andy and I looked at one another because we'd been into churches in Wiltshire and Gloucestershire. And we found, in churches where the pews are old, we found these marks carved in the back of some pews, about 1 in 20 churches. So they had a complete calendar. Now, initially, we were interested because it was interesting. And we'd never heard of anything like that. Bear with me. So, I was showing, I can't even find it now. We found a book, and we bought it, and it cost over £600. And it's got every single one of those marks. And it's published by the Church of England. So they know and knew. All these symbols that not all of them, but many of the symbols we find have been acknowledged and accepted and are an intrinsic part of the church. So we've done manticores, we've done I bought these today. If you know anybody called a Palmer, they probably went on a pilgrimage. And during the Tudor period, it was fashionable to demonstrate that you had been on a pilgrimage, and they used to wear these tiny little shells on their coats. Now this is interesting. This is interesting because this is on the pews back here. Shells. So this, I suspect, was a centre of pilgrimage, and people came here at one time. And these kind of things were worn. This was just a dress affectation. But we found a whole number of these on the ends of the really early choir pews. You will notice, if you look across at one another, every single pew has got an image of a cross. Some of them are the same, but most of them are different. There are images everywhere. And it's so few people even notice them. They just take them for granted. But they relate back to the period when these symbols were very, very important. So, Vicky's going to help me now, or Anthony's going to help me, because I cannot get this woman's name right.
It's Frieswide.
Well, I'm going to say it's Frieswide. It's on one of the pews up there. And when I spoke to Jill Hall, she said she hadn't noticed it. And we looked at it, and we've talked about it since. And I've just spent a month searching it. We've just arranged for it to go into AI, because we can't find any direct reference to why it's on one of the choir stalls. But I think you may be looking at the original saint that gave the purpose of this church. Now, when I talked about bestiaries and these grotesque animals that were given to the builders to do the designs for various elements, for the bosses and what have you in the church, underneath the misericords back there, that's a dragon. And it's underneath the sea. And you could have gone in there if you've not lifted it and never know it. And there were lots of animals like that underneath the pews at the back here. You have to lift the seats and turn them over. Obviously, we can't all do that. Can I just tell you one thing? If you ever do it, they're evil the way they flip down on you and take your fingers out if you don't get it right. So, I've dealt with some of the images and why they're here and how they're here and their relationship and how their origins are. We've dealt with clog almanacs, witch marks. There are lots of illustrations of Apotropaics. There are lots of books written about them, and there are lots of conferences these days which we hold. the most exciting thing, and I'm going to conclude here, although if you want to ask some questions, I'm happy to answer them. Can I just say, it doesn't matter what I believe, these churches, these buildings are the most culturally important buildings. Where else are you finding 1,000 years of culture? And a diverse culture, a varying culture, a culture that it is the essence of what we regard ourselves as Britons and English. Too many of these buildings are being left to too few people to conscientiously uphold, keep going. It's so important. They are the most intrinsic part of our culture. And I go back to my motivation and Larkin poem. Who will be the last to know this place for what it was? I hope I've not overindulged your patience. I'm very happy to answer questions. I think I'm going to draw a line now, because otherwise it could go on for days. Anthony looks at me. Somebody had a question, I know there. That's the
yes, please, can you help me? Under one of the other misericors, probably next to that dragon one, there's a head of a green man.
Yes.
And what I'd like to know is, I'm assuming it was carved there when it was very, very important what religion you held, whether you were Catholic or Protestant. How could anyone be bold enough to carve such a symbol inside a church when it really mattered what you believed? Was it maybe because paganism wasn't counted like other religions? It was just a folk belief.
What I've tried to convey is that paganism isn't necessarily a coherent single entity. It was part of public folklore. And nature was a fundamental element in that relationship that people had. It was their lives. They depended upon the weather, the climate, the land, for everything. And out of that are beliefs in fertility and all sorts of ideas about nature. And when you go to the bistros, you find that there are illustrations that the stonemasons and the carvers copied. But those are the stylized outcomes of a culture. The culture was living in a world where you were associated with nature. It was you couldn't separate yourself from being part of nature. You know, and you know, it's outside the bounds of today's talk, but I suspect that we would all benefit by restoring that relationship and understanding we are a component of a huge cosmos, and not the woolly boys. I don't want to talk about opinions, but it's what I believe. And the vicar agrees with me. It doesn't matter. As long as the vicar agrees. Are there any other questions? Yes, sorry.
So the wall paintings.
The wall paintings?
The wall paintings.
Yeah.
They had a didactic class. So what were people then, how much were people who were in the church carving their house or whatever, how much were they being forced to believe certain religious things? Because the feeling is that they were walking around putting magical marks into the walls rather than fearing.
Most of the wall paintings were based on elements of the Bible. For instance, nearly every church, when you come in through the door on this side, would be a St. Christopher. That would welcome you. That would be a welcoming. That was a cliche. That was a classical thing. A St. Christopher opposite the door. The Doom paintings are based on this idea of punishment and redemption. So punishment, all of the images are graphically horrendous. They're meant to intimidate you and make you fear failing to survive purgatory and finishing up in hell. And on the redemption side, they're glorious, and there are angels, and they're beautiful people. And theirs is the ascent into heaven.
Yeah, so that's how you
I'm sorry.
They're carving these marks to protect themselves from burglary.
The ideas I would convey is that their belief was in nature, and they had a belief in redemption and punishment. Therefore, they had a fear of those forces, of good and evil. Well, there are lots of ways of describing it. And so the votives were their simple, humble, but nonetheless sincere way of protecting themselves. And I mean, even within the church, although there are elements within it, you'll still find people that cross themselves. And there are most of us that say, good luck on that, or, I mean, all of those attitudes are intrinsic, everyday elements of our conversation and our thinking, for all our science, for everything, you know, and this is where religion and faith come in, and I'm overstepping the mark. Sorry.
Who actually did the painting? Would it have been a clergy person, or would they have instructed a painter?
I honestly don't know exactly, and they're very, very badly recorded. What we do have great recordings of are of stonemasons and itinerant tradesmen, and we've got detailed records of how Salisbury was built and several other sharps and what have you. I can only imagine that they were itinerant tradespeople. Now, the analysis that we're now doing, it's in their work, the way they created the pigments, it was so skillful. I mean, they didn't just use a pot of red paint, they created those red paints, and they would use 4 or 5 elements and all sorts of pigments and minerals. And it was incredibly skillful. And there are people I know better than me to answer that question. But that's the best I can do for you at the moment. You can escape. And I think, thank you so much for putting up with me. And when you go around, the most flattering thing you could do is look at the walls, look outside. And some places they've gone, other places you'll be amazed at the abundance. Jill, thank you.
As I said earlier, Steve has given his absolute almost to us for this afternoon. He's been working endlessly, he's been moving stones, and it's just been brilliant, and he hasn't asked for anything from us. He's just given entirely. So we think that we're
That's